Good afternoon. Hello and welcome to today's live webinar, which follows on from our previous 5 really successful, gosh, I can't string a sentence together, so that bodes well for the next 2 hours, doesn't it? So this session follows on from our 5 previous successful knowledge sessions, where we focused on the business critical subject of equality, diversity and inclusion. I'm so pleased that you've chosen to join us today, and I really do hope that you've brought open minds and you're ready to receive some interesting information, thought-provoking conversation, and perhaps, if you're lucky, a little dose of inspiration too. The session, as always, is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who has registered for today's webinar within a couple of days of the session, and it will also appear on our website, intuitiverecruitment.com, under the Insights and Resources tab. So if you do want to catch up on it again, if you have to leave early and want to catch up on what you've missed, and indeed if you would like to share it with your own community, your colleagues, your networks, then you'll know where to find it so you can pass on the knowledge that you're going to get today. My name is Nina Lockwood and I'm the founder and chief exec of Intuitive Talent Solutions. We are a boutique search agency providing interim management and executive search services to our clients in the UK transport sector. For the past 11 and a half years now, this has been focused primarily on rail. But last year, my colleague, Caroline Wilson, our head of client engagement, launched our bus division, which is going like the clappers, which is really good to see. We're really delighted to be working with the bus sector as well as rail and investigating other areas of the transport industry too. We've been increasingly engaged with the supply chain and in particular for the great work we've been doing with our client base and our community around the area of diversity, providing a diverse candidate shortlist for our client organisations. We've been overwhelmed by the positive feedback that we've had from previous knowledge sessions, and I am 100% confident that today will provide you with food for thought and inspiration, as well as some practical tools that you can take away with you to make change happen in your own organisation. And that for me is the key objective for these 2 hours. I know how precious your time is. I appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today. And I would like you to go away with at least one thing that you can do differently, perhaps more, but let's just go for one. We also host the Intuitive Insights podcast series, where I've been lucky enough to be joined by members of the transport family who have shared their career stories and their own views on the industry. And you can find all the episodes of the podcast, as well as previous webinars, on our website, as I said, intuitiverecruitment.com. The previous webinars, we've covered various different aspects of diversity, and we've had some amazing guests, including Lorraine Martins, Sharon Amasu, Alex Hines, DDS Dobson-Smith, Anit Chandarana, Gareth Hind, Natalie Penrose and Jess Bates. And Ian Chapman and Harry Saville were our most recent guests at the end of last year when they ran a session for us on neurodiversity. I'm joined today by Elaine Johnson, who is the Director of People for Great Places Housing Group, and Professor Julia Rouse, who's got the most amazing job title I've come across in a while, which is Professor of Decent Work and Productivity at Manchester Metropolitan University. Elaine and Julia have very generously given their time this afternoon to share their experience of championing change for Black, Asian and minoritised ethnic leadership in the social housing sector. This was following this programme of change, which has been led by Julia and Elaine, has followed the CABE report's findings in 2018 that the housing sector was overwhelmingly led by white people. So the transport industry is in the same boat, and hence why I've thought that it would be interesting for colleagues from the transport industry to hear from a different industry sector in terms of ideas, things that have worked, things that have not worked, struggles that have been had, obstacles that have been overcome. We'll hear about the background to the Boost programme, the obstacles identified, the methods used to effect the change and the learnings so far. And as I said earlier, I'm 100% confident that you will take something interesting away with you today. As with all our previous discussions, inclusive leadership is upfront and central. Inclusive leadership is the kind of leadership that values all team members, invites diverse perspectives, and creates an atmosphere where people feel that their opinions and contributions improve the company's well-being as well as their colleagues. Slowly but surely, inclusive leadership is being acknowledged as the most appropriate way to lead an organisation into the future world of work. And just to be clear, you do not have to have the word leader in your job title in order to be one. I am a firm believer that we are all leaders in our own way, and as such are all accountable for the change that we want to see in the world. Mindsets are beginning to shift, and today companies have a greater self-awareness around the demographics of who they employ and serve, as well as how the diversity and inclusion of employees and ideas can have a competitive advantage. I'm mindful of the fact that it's being increasingly talked about, but what I'd like to do with today's webinar is to provide some practical examples of what inclusive leadership looks like on a day-to-day basis, and some tools, as I've said, that you might be inspired to take away and use within your own organisation. I am over the moon to be joined for this important conversation by two individuals who genuinely bring a wealth of knowledge to this subject. But I do want to address the elephant in the room straight away, and that knowledge that you have three white women on your screens just now. We will come into this in more detail as the conversation goes on, I'm sure. But in the same way as we approach things when we're recruiting for our client organisations, ultimately it's the best person who gets the job. And in this case, looking at this subject and the work that's being done in Greater Manchester housing sector, then I honestly believe that Elaine and Julia are the best people to tell us what's happening. But of course, other people have been involved who have had their own lived experience to bring to the party. Elaine Johnson has been Director of People at Great Places Housing Group since 2021, with responsibility for HR, learning and development and engagement for 1,000 colleagues working across Greater Manchester, Lancashire and South Yorkshire. She's worked in housing for nearly 20 years, having led HR, comms, transformation, tech and community investment teams for two other housing providers before joining Great Places. Before life in housing, she worked for a care provider, an airline and in retail distribution for Tesco and Littlewoods. Elaine is passionate about how organisations inspire and support people to reach their full potential for their own well-being and for the achievement of organisational excellence. Elaine leads the Change Champions Group in the Boost programme, which is a coalition of Greater Manchester housing providers committed to changing their cultures so that ethnically diverse leaders can emerge and thrive. Julia Rouse is Professor of Decent Work and Productivity at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her current research involves running experiments with organisations to improve people management practices. The Good Employment Learning Lab works with CIPD and other stakeholders to find what works to improve people management skills of line managers. And the Boost programme is working with Greater Manchester housing providers to change housing associations so that ethnically diverse leaders can emerge and thrive. Julia's newest project, which is it's quite a mammoth one, I would imagine, Julia, is in the NHS, pioneering a rhythms workplace maternity coaching process for women and managers and an evolve organisational change process. So whilst neither of our guests today hail from the transport industry, I'm sure that you will agree with me they have a wealth of knowledge to share which will be pertinent and relevant to the challenges that we experience in the transport industry today in terms of equity, diversity and inclusion. So the running order for today, we will hear from Elaine first in terms of her involvement in the Boost programme, and then Julia will share her contribution from her own perspective before we take a 10-minute comfort break at 3:30. When we come back, the three of us will take the discussion a bit deeper in terms of the practical experience of the implementation of the change and talk about how this might add value to the transport sector. We will then lead into a Q&A where I would encourage you to post any questions you have in the chat box, and we will do our best to come to as many of those as possible in the time that we have available. A quick shout out to the queen of the chat box, Caroline Wilson, who will be present in the chat room throughout the webinar, and will be making sure that your questions are passed on to me at the appropriate time, because I'm completely incapable of doing more than one thing at a time. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Elaine Johnson, Director of People for Great Places Housing Group, to today's Intuitive Knowledge session. Elaine, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Still with me. So I'll start just by giving a little bit of background of social housing for people that don't know the sector. So social housing we used to call council housing, and it's housing that's provided for people in housing need. So across the country, social housing providers house about 22% of the population, and in Greater Manchester it's slightly higher than that. As a sector, we tend to work very, very closely together. It's a very collaborative sector in that, unlike a lot of industries, we are not competing for customers. We actually have more customers than we can deal with. I'm sure you've all heard the stories about the housing lists that everybody's dealing with. There is certainly a housing crisis in this country. There are definitely more people that need safe, affordable houses than we can provide. But our role is to provide housing, and it isn't just about bricks and mortars. For most housing providers, it's actually about providing homes from which people can live successful lives. So that's what the sector does. In Greater Manchester, there are 26 separate housing providers, some of which have been transferred from local councils. Others have a history of housing that's come through churches and religious-based institutions. But we all have the same ethos. We are all here to provide safe, affordable housing for people in housing need. So going back to where Nina started the webinar today, where did Boost come from? Well, as Nina mentioned, in 2018, the CABE report was commissioned, which was looking at housing associations and looking at the leadership of housing associations. Of the 64 housing providers that took part in that survey, only 3 of them had non-white chief executives, and only 12 of them had an executive team with anybody in that exec director team that wasn't white. 3/4 of them had exclusively white executive teams, and 2 actually had an executive team which was made up entirely of white males. And actually, when you look back on the last 5 years before 2018, very, very little had changed. So if you think of that in terms of the leadership of these organisations that are providing safe, affordable homes for people in housing need, if you actually look at who those people are, who are our customers, who are the tenants and residents, what you see is that social housing tenants are disproportionately more likely to be from Black, Asian or minoritised ethnic backgrounds. In fact, 44% of Black African families in this country are social housing renters. 40% of Black Caribbean families are also social housing renters. And when you compare that to white people, we actually provide housing for only 16% of white people. So if you look at that, you can see we've got a leadership of this sector, which is predominantly white, that is providing services to a customer base that isn't. So the decision makers in the sector are working from their sort of white perspective, working from their history, their culture, their customs as white people, yet providing services and housing. Really important. If you think of what's the most important thing for most people, it is their home. It is that base from which they build their lives, they bring up their children, they make their memories. And yet the people that were making decisions were predominantly white, from white backgrounds. When we looked across Greater Manchester housing provider, of the 26 housing providers that we had, 16 of them were 90% white in their leadership teams, and actually eight of them were exclusively white. So at that point, we decided that actually something had to change. We had to think about how we did things differently, because what we were doing was only producing white leaders that didn't reflect our customer base and didn't reflect those people that were partaking of our services. So that's when we approached Manchester University. They had previously done some work for us on looking at the barriers to females coming into leadership roles. So it seemed to us like the best place to start. So we worked with them initially on a pilot project where 13 of the Greater Manchester housing providers took part in the pilot project. And given the fact that most people that end up in leadership roles at some point in their career have been, for want of a better word, spotted, or somebody's taken an interest in their career, somebody's seen them and thought, there's somebody with a bit of talent, there's somebody that actually looks sort of bright and sparky, and somebody that can actually hold people's attention and lead people. And people then have sort of extended their sponsorship to them. So that might be with some coaching, with some mentoring. It might be by selecting them for a particular project, or thinking about a secondment opportunity. But at some point, somebody's taken an interest in them and started to grow them and develop their career. Most people do that with people that look like them. They sort of see people that potentially think, oh, that was me 20 years ago, and reach out to them. And as people do that to people like them, most of those people were white people. So as part of the project and part of the pilot, we decided that we'd sort of replicate that, but we'd do it in a slightly different way. And in the pilot, we actually call this reciprocal mentoring. So we put together a white senior leader as a mentor from one housing association, with a mentee who was from an ethnically diverse background in another organisation. And the idea of that was that the white mentor would fulfil a usual mentoring role. So, help people with their career development, help them with their learning, help them with their growth, and do that normal mentoring sort of relationship. But in return, the reciprocal element of it was that the mentee would talk to the white leader about their lived experience of being somebody from an ethnically diverse background, working in housing, working in the sector, and some of the barriers that they felt they'd come across, and how that felt to live and work in that situation. And that's how we set it up. And I suppose that was the first learn, really, because when we went out to the 13 organisations, we asked them for their most senior ethnically diverse manager, with the potential to move at least one, if not two, levels further up within their organisation. And we were sort of expecting that people would come forward at sort of heads of service, senior manager level. And actually, when we actually put that call out, the people that came forward were at best first line managers. And that's where we sort of realised that actually we need to start working a lot further upstream. We didn't actually have those people at that level. Sort of ethnically minoritized people were lower down in the organisational level. So we did have to take a little bit of a step back at that. I suppose the difference in this programme between it being just a normal mentoring programme is we also put in a change champion. So each organisation had a change champion, and they were charged with bringing together in their organisation their mentor and their mentee, and having conversations about what's coming out of that relationship with their mentor and mentee. What were we learning? What were the cultural barriers to ethnically minoritized leaders coming forward and really sort of growing, progressing and thriving in our organisations? So we did the pilot, and actually what we learned from the pilot, and I suppose I intimated this when I said when we realised we were working a lot further upstream, we realised there was an awful lot of issues that we needed to resolve and unpick. One of the first ones was there wasn't any role models there for our ethnically diverse colleagues. There just weren't the role models. There weren't people there in leadership positions. They couldn't see people like themselves in those senior positions, even in middle manager positions. So there was no role models there. We also learned that we had a very white culture. And actually, that was probably one of the biggest barriers. And a lot of our ethnically diverse colleagues told us that when they came into work, they couldn't be their true selves. They actually sort of had to mould themselves into our white culture. And we had very, very white cultures. The other thing that came forward is there wasn't any cultural curiosity either, that our leaders and managers were not seeking to understand from our ethnically diverse colleagues what was happening in their lives, what was happening in their backgrounds, their history, how they felt about things. And the other thing we found is that in recruitment, although we were doing things that in a textbook were all the right ways to do recruitment, and we were doing all the normal things that you do in terms of having your role descriptions and doing your assessments, your interviews. But actually what we had is recruitment based on people like me, that actually those were the people that were then being appointed into jobs. And there was very much this feeling that our ethnically diverse colleagues had to leave their lives, their culture, everything about themselves at the door and become different people when they were in work. And I suppose really, when you look at that, we then started to think about what was happening on the other side for our customers and how that was affecting our customers. Because actually, ultimately, that's what it's all about. How are we running our organisations, and are our organisations delivering the best service we could for our customers? At the time, of course, there was the Grenfell situation, and you look at that and you think of the people that died in that terrible fire, and then you look at the people that were running that housing association. They were all white. The people that ran that housing block were all white. They had no real understanding, no real empathy or even compassion for their customers in that particular block. And ultimately, we also had the situation with our Ashak in Rochdale, who was a little boy who died because his social housing provided home was damp and mouldy. And that brings me to another piece of work that was done, the Better Social Housing Review, and they were looking at social housing, and this came out of the Grenfell inquiry to say, how could we do this better? And what came out of that is that tenants from ethnically diverse backgrounds were much more likely to be living in the poorest quality homes that we provided. Those were the homes that were more likely to be damp and mouldy, that were more likely to be overcrowded and have the least access to green spaces. So pulling all that together, that was our real burning platform to say, well, actually, we've done the pilot, we've learned lots of things about our organisation and our culture and our decision making. And I have to say, I've worked in housing a long time. The people I've worked with in housing are genuinely people that are very caring about our customers. They genuinely really, really want to do the right thing by our customers. We've all got values. We all talk about fairness as part of our values. But actually, what a big, I suppose, blind spot for us has been that actually we were not genuinely understanding huge parts of our customer base. So from the pilot, that gave us that burning platform to say, we need to take this forward now. We need to learn from the pilot. And actually, rather than think about this as a mentor-mentee mentoring program, this is a massive cultural change, a massive cultural shift that we need to do in our organisations that makes them much more inclusive. And that actually, when we are making decisions, operational decisions about housing, that we have different voices, different perspectives, different backgrounds in the room that will inform our decision making and make our services far more inclusive. So from that point, we commissioned Manchester University to actually then do a 3-year programme with us, which was about implementing that cultural change in terms of how we were going to change the faces around our executive tables so that we had more black, brown faces around that table so that our decision making could be much more inclusive. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Julia, and she'll start to talk about the detail of what we actually did as we started working with Manchester University. We are now 12 months into our 3-year programme. We're still learning. There's still loads of things that are coming out of it, which are really, really insightful. And those are the things that we want to share with you so far.
Thanks, Elaine. So I'm a professor actually in the Centre for Decent Work and Productivity at Manchester Metropolitan University. And we're a team of people who are interested in really practical ways of creating decent work and also balancing that, always trying to find that sweet spot where decent work is also productive work. So we're very sympathetic to the organisational and management problem as well as to the plight of workers. And we do things like, for example, evaluate the Good Employment Charter in Greater Manchester. And before we worked on Boost, as Elaine suggested, we had a project called Growl, which was generating routes for women's leadership. And I think that's why the social housing folks approached us. And they said, would we come and do a programme? They didn't know what to do, but they knew that they had massive underrepresentation of ethnically diverse colleagues. And my first reaction was, well, is it for me as a white woman to be doing this work? I've done an awful lot of work in gender, feel very comfortable there. But is this my space? I don't want to take up space that should be occupied by somebody else, or to claim the voices of other people. And I came back to campus and I looked left and right, and there wasn't somebody who was terribly obvious either, possibly because we have exactly the same issues internally. Every sector's facing these issues. So I approached some ethnically diverse colleagues and to talk to them about it. And some of them said to me, Julia, we're tired. And it's time that white people sorted out their own house. And as a woman who's done work around women's equality, I get it. Whilst I never want a man to come in and take over and tell women what they want, I also get it that it's often the busy women for whom we're trying to represent who are doing the work of trying to do gender equality in organisations. So from that point of view, we decided to move forwards. Always, and I hope always, with our ethnically diverse colleagues, and always passing the mic where we can, always listening, radically listening. This project has changed me, radically listening, and but equally understanding that the organisational change needs to come from a lot of our white colleagues, and perhaps can be heard by our white colleagues from another white colleague at times as well. So these are complex issues. We don't always get it right. I think we have to create an environment where we can talk about this really difficult stuff on a day-to-day basis, but nevertheless, here we are. So first of all, in our initial conversations, we were asked to run a mentoring program. And we said, well, the problem with mentoring programs is that they help people to fit within the status quo. And you have such a large underrepresentation issue in leadership that suggests that there's something wrong with your status quo. Now, I've done enough diversity work to know that the number one thing that makes a difference is serious buy-in from the top. So it was a really good sign for me when I had buy-in from several of the chief executives of housing associations who said, yeah, we buy that. We get that. We think that a much broader, much more challenging program is required rather than just putting some of our staff on a mentoring program. And that's where we started with the pilot project. And now we're running Boost. Boost is funded under something called a knowledge transfer partnership. Now, this is a government source of funding run by Innovate UK that enables a university to work on an innovation project with an organisation. And in this case, a partnership of organisations. The organisation puts in about half the money and Innovate UK puts in the rest of the money. And it enables us to hire a KTP associate who is the main project manager for the everyday work of the project. And then the academics come along and they input into the project to help to develop it, whilst the kind of project management goes back more at base in the organisations. And necessarily so, because otherwise, how is the change going to get embedded? So this isn't just about running an isolated programme. This is about developing a learning process where we start with a theory of change, we test that theory of change, we learn together, putting practitioner knowledge and academic knowledge side by side, and together we make sense, we iterate the programme. And the idea is that at the end of Boost, we hope to come up with a package of an evidence-based approach to creating change for ethnic diversity, leadership, equality in organisations that we can use in other organisations. So what do we do in Boost? Well, we do a number of things, but at the absolute backbone of Boost is what we call our movement of allies. So I was really pleased that my client agreed to the use of the word movement, because I was absolutely convinced that in our complex organisations and within such a complex issue as race, there is absolutely no point in an EDI officer or even a chief executive being committed and able to do this work. What we need is to build a movement across the hierarchy of command and across all areas of work, who are going to represent change and who are going to lead on structural change within the organisations as well. Well, how do you do that? So we decided that we would build our movement, and we're starting with the participants in our programmes. So starting with our mentors, our mentees, and our change champions, and building out from there. Our allies meet quarterly, and we do a lot of education work around the corners of the problem. We create platforms for people to share their stuff, and we co-create together as to the changes that we're trying to create. So within that broader envelope, there are some packages of work. So first of all, of course, we're working on data. So we're helping the housing associations to recognise where they have quality data and where they have less quality data. And one of the things that's lovely about this project is that because it's a partnership, organisations can learn from one another. So, for example, we've had organisations teach one another how to measure their ethnicity pay gap. But we also need to understand that those inequalities of representation vary, and we haven't done all of this work yet, but I'd like us to look across the kind of occupations and professions, areas of leadership, to really understand the corners of the issue that's causing, that tells us the shape of the problem and that causes it. And we all know that what we measure matters. And so we're working towards each organisation having a kind of knowledge board or a traffic light system, where some key data will be assessed at board or management level on an annual basis, so that this issue can be continuously tracked. The housing sector, I'm told, was possibly in a better position 10 years ago. It's done phenomenally well in terms of female representation in leadership. But it's really clear that without significant change, there is no real prospect of step change around this issue in housing. So we really do need to keep management attention on the issue. One of the things we're doing in Boost is building a legacy statement and getting each organisation to sign up to that, which will force them to put their attention on the issue for a period of years. This isn't an issue you can resolve quickly. At the heart of the project is our mentoring programme that we're calling disruptive mentoring. So we've gone from reciprocal mentoring to disruptive mentoring, precisely because it is there to disrupt. So there's good reason to believe that ethnically diverse colleagues may have missed out on some career coaching for the reasons that Elaine gave. We match our ethnically diverse colleagues with a senior leader from another organisation, and we ask them to talk to one another so that the leader receives some mentoring in what it's like to be from an ethnically diverse background around here, and the mentee gets some career coaching. We're using the GROW coaching model in terms of the detail of the coaching, but actually also we want the relationship to involve other aspects, in particular sponsorship. So there is some evidence that minoritized people are over-mentored and under-sponsored. So we want our senior leaders to help our mentees to have stretch projects, to go to areas of the organisations they wouldn't necessarily usually have a view of, to shadow them in their own work, to talk to them about what leadership might mean, for them to speak well about them and the work that they've done with them in public places, in order that their name gets out there. In other words, there's a number of people who get behind the idea of how do we help to advance this person. Allied to this is our change projects. And we ask each organisation to do one change project within each cohort of mentoring. This year, most of our organisations chose inclusive recruitment, and they've all tried different approaches to inclusive recruitment, targeting different aspects of the recruitment process. As I say, they're a learning community. So they have been meeting together regularly to talk about what they're learning about their learning processes. And we're going to be having an event on June 21st, to which you're very welcome, where they'll be telling us more about their change projects. Those change projects will then pass on into the HR team in Greater Manchester housing providers, because inclusive recruitment is a long range innovation project. So we kickstart it and then we pass it on. In the next mentoring round, we're going to be looking at progression. And in the third mentoring round, we're going to look at flourishing and thriving. Because we do know that sometimes we appoint ethnically diverse people to senior leader roles and they don't stick. And there might be a number of reasons for that. And we need to create environments where people can stick and where they can make the contribution they need to make for themselves and for us. The next element of the project is culture change. So our movement of allies, and I should say we do a lot of allyship training in the development of our disruptive mentoring process and our movement. Let me just give you a little definition of allyship that we're using. And this represents the fact that for us, allyship is certainly not about going around describing yourself as an ally with a great big T-shirt on and getting a lot of social capital from that yourself. It's very much a label somebody else can give to you on the basis of some practical actions that you take in the benefit of others. It's also, though, about being the kind of leader who gets the barriers out of the way of change and that sponsors and enables structural change within the organisation. So allyship for us is a high quality relationship that can support and advance the career journeys of ethnically diverse colleagues. Okay, lots of organisations are doing that, but our definition goes on. Allies also transform organisational processes and create more equitable structures and evaluation systems, whilst also benefiting allies. in the process. So there is some disagreement in the literature about whether allies should ever get anything out of allyship because of this real danger, I think, of false allyship. But my belief is that we need to appeal to people's human interests. People want to get things out of things, but also our allies who really engage tell us that this is actually quite a life-changing experience for them, that they get an awful lot out of it in terms of their own learning and education. It's really important to their job satisfaction. So in fact, there's a lot to be got out of this from the allies as well. So we want to create also systems change. And we're just going through an interesting phase in the project at the moment of inviting each of the housing associations to develop their own boost strategy and to sign up to a commitment, a minimum commitment, and an action plan for change, which is all part of the process of keeping management attention on the issue. So we won't be prescribing exactly what they do. Each organisation is its own complex system. We will be creating a kind of diagnosis and planning process whereby organisations can think about that, but each of them will be using their own creativity and leaning in on what's possible in their organisations to create change. It's really crucial that we then harness the progression of ethnically diverse colleagues and their new voice in our movements, their ability to come forwards and say, we think we're underrepresenting some of our tenants in various ways for service improvement. Because the ultimate aim of having a more diverse staff is that we do improve services. So in year 3 of the project, we're going to be doing a lot more work here. And in a way, it's an opportunity to give our mentees that leadership opportunity by leading some service development innovations. Now, that doesn't mean that we want to see our ethnically diverse colleagues purely and utterly through the lens of the colour of their skin or their heritage. So we have to step carefully here, don't we, and not over-assuming what people know about different communities from looking at them or observing on a form or what have you as to their heritage. But at the same time, we have to recognise that often they do have insights that we as white leaders lack. And so we need to do that work. And then lastly, we're doing a lot of evaluation work to find out what works, where and why. I think it's really boring in evaluation just to measure if it worked or not. The much more interesting question is to know, what is it about the context that enabled this to land? What enabled it to accelerate? And what was it about the context that stopped it working? Now, in some ways, that's a challenge back to us as program designers to think about how we may need to work with the context to scaffold the context to be ready for the change. But in another way, it's also turning back to our leaders and saying, these are the things that you need to change about your organisation in order to make sure that change can really happen here. Now, this all sounds probably quite clean. And to some extent, you know, we're working through a range of work packages as you normally would with a project. But there is also some really important overarching learning, excuse me, learning that's coming out and that comes back to us in rounds and rounds and rounds that we're working our way through. One aspect of that is, how do we deal with variation in commitment? I think in any project, that's one of our problems. How do we raise motivation? How do we hold people to account? How do we become more clear about what we're asking and then hold them to account for actually doing that? Another issue that we're facing is, how do we keep people safe? If we're asking people to speak truth to power, it's our business to give them some protection. And equally, a program like this can't create complete safety. So how do we message to people how they can read their environments and think about what challenge they can bring to their organisations safely? what challenge perhaps would be less safe, how they make decisions about when it's time to be courageous, or when they want to bring in other allies to work with them towards some change, whether or not they want to raise that in a third party confidential sort of way. So we're trying to develop a range of kind of system level solutions to how we keep people safe. I would say that an important observation within the disruptive mentoring program is that doing allyship training is really challenging. We talk a lot about the defensiveness that we can each bring to talking about race and racism. As a group, we've done quite a lot of work on what language we want to use to talk about these issues, but without getting into language policing. We've talked about setting up a culture of, I'll try not to give offence, I'll try not to take offence, and we will seek to fix any offence that is created in order that we can work through conflict in a constructive fashion. We've talked about how it can be really hard, I think, for white middle class men in particular, or white working class men actually, to hear some of what we're talking about. And I think that's because if we look through the protected characteristics, white men can feel quite invisible or excluded. And yet every human being worked really hard to get where they got, or most of us did. And we've each had our struggles. What I find quite helpful is to bring class into the room. Class isn't included in the Equalities Act, and so it isn't one of the protected characteristics for a range of reasons, one of which is difficult to measure. And yet we all know that it's real, it's really real. And it's the reason why a lot of people might be able to be sitting there thinking, yeah, but I grew up on a council estate, but I had a single parent. Do you know how little support I got through whatever struggle I've got, but it's not protected. It's not represented in this EDI work. Does that mean that I don't matter? And that can really make it difficult to listen to others' experiences. We've found that by bringing class into the room, I think it lowers some of those barriers. And also challenging people to think about, but what are the challenges that ethnically diverse colleagues have that you haven't had? So a really big change moment for me was when a really bright, dedicated young black man said, well, every time I go into a supermarket, I know that the security guard follows me, and I make damn sure that I don't use one of those self-service machines and that I get a receipt. And it was kind of heartbreaking to hear, but like really unsurprising to the other people in the room, right? So there are kind of these moments where you know in movement meetings that something's shifted in yourself and in others when we come to realize and have empathy much more for others. And then the last thing I would say, a big observation from the mentoring program, is that we've had to learn with a lot of internalized shutdown of potential in our ethnically diverse colleagues. From their racialized experiences of schools, sometimes of migration, and of careers and of society at large, we found that a lot of them had counted themselves out of leadership. And that it's taken the first year of the program to help them to think about different ways of leading, how they are already leading, because some people in housing could be managing 7 or 8 people, but be at a relatively low level, and to see their own potential. We've heard people whose families say, just keep safe, don't take any risks, because their families have just about managed to sort of get life and limb together after a migration experience. So they've needed to break away from that. We've heard some gendered experiences of women who've really had to push within their cultural backgrounds to have a career. How about a leadership career? So we've needed to go quite slowly and quite gently with some of the people on the mentoring program, and that's made me realize that sometimes we perhaps rush in with these sort of brash words like leadership, and we need to talk to people about their values, about their experiences, and about how they can conceive of themselves as leaders. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
There we go. Here I am, tapping on the door to get back in. Elaine and Julia, thank you so much for that. I will say here and now, I've been on a roller coaster of emotions since Elaine started her session, and then moving into some of the contributions from Julia. And I guess, you know, I'm on a journey with this, as is everyone, I guess. And I have friends of mine who've talked about, you know, for the example that you've just used, Julia, who have to have what they refer to as the conversation with their children, that you never ever come out of a shop without a receipt. I've never had to have that conversation with my daughter. It just really, it does. It makes me really angry, and I find it heartbreaking, like you've said. But I don't have that experience. I've grown up in a different community, a different environment, with a different colour skin, and therefore a different lived experience. So I am on a journey, and I think part of that journey, I keep coming back to an expression that I heard used on a webinar actually during the pandemic, which was, it's so important for us all to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, with having conversations that we might not want to have, we might not feel like we're equipped to have, that may or may not become confrontational if we say the wrong thing at the wrong time, in the wrong tone of voice to the wrong person. But if we don't have the conversations, then change is never going to happen. We're kind of leading up to the break at 3:30, and we're going to come back and I've got some quite, I guess, some big questions to ask in terms of the contributions that you've both made, and I definitely do want to delve deeper into the inclusive recruitment learnings that you've had in that first phase of the change programme. I'd love to know, in terms of, well, one of the things that you mentioned, Julia, was the GROW model. Now, I remember that from going back many, many years to some training that I did when I had a proper job and I worked in a bank. Would you just mind, for the audience, just in case people haven't been through that, could you just tell us what that GROW stands for, Julia, please?
Let's see if I can remember it.
Sorry.
So you start out with goals. So you work with the person you're coaching to think about what their goal is, and that can be really tough, can't it? Particularly we've found in this program with people who are really self-limited what their goals are. Yeah. And we've asked. Remember, we're asking our coaches to act as allies. So we want them to help people to spot higher goals. To be able to look into what they're doing in their day job, and to really pull out what it is, you know, that they have done and they can do, to really see their potential in new ways. So it's not just about getting them to see their own goals, it's helping them to see a higher goal.
Yeah.
Then we've got reality. So what is your reality? What are your options? Well, as we're using allyship, we're trying to create a new reality. So that issue of giving somebody a stretch project, taking them to a board meeting, getting them to shadow you, using your position as a senior leader to see the job opportunities that exist over here and over here that you can't see from your current job, all means, again, that that you're seeing a different reality to the one that you could only see in your narrow silo. Remembering that a lot of ethnically diverse colleagues may not have friends and family to do that for them, because of the issue of underrepresentation. So they need leaders to be able to tell them, and to tell them how you get there. What's the unwritten rules? How do you get on around here in relation to these different areas of work? How do people build their careers? So then you can start seeing your options. And so that's your O. What are your options?
Mm.
And so again, it's helping them to see better options than before the coaching experience. And then finally, and also creating for them some of those options. And really crucially, using your power to create options for this person by things like giving them a project. We've talked about maybe having a placement, switching jobs, all sorts of things that can be done to actually create opportunity. And then it's will, and it's what are you going to do and what motivation do you bring to this? So again, it's about building up people's fire and confidence that they're actually going to start taking some actions and following through. And I have to say, Nina, we've set it up as a 1-year program, but we now think 1 year is probably not enough. And we're asking our mentors and mentees to stay together. And a lot of these relationships are going to stick because the mentors really like them as well. But we're asking them to stay together, more over the medium term, so that they can act on those. They can go round that cycle a few times.
Yeah, I think this is such a critical point, and it's one of the things which I really appreciate about this program is that it's a 3-year program, the Boost program, isn't it? You've not gone into it and said, right, we're going to do this over 6 months and then see what happens. And I know that there's constant evaluation happening, but there's an acknowledgement that something that requires the level of change, the scale of change that this requires cannot be done in a 6 months, 1 year. You need to give it a decent chance to actually take.
Elaine, what do you think? In theory, the theory is that we walk away and that Boost still exists, but also that ultimately Boost isn't needed because it's embedded in each of the organisations. But realistically, where do you think we are with that?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about Boost being 3 years. That's our relationship with Manchester University. That's the learning phase almost.
Yeah.
And once we've completed that programme, it will continue. And the idea, as Julie has said, about building this movement. So in each of the 3 years, we have a different mentor and a different mentee. They join our movement. So each year, that movement is growing. It's growing in each organisation. And the idea is that we build this cohort of people who have been through this journey, who are absolutely engaged in allyship and cultural change, and they've got far more broader understanding, and that we will continue to create this change. The other thing that we had towards the end of year 1, we did have a little bit of a oh shit, if we missed something moment, which was to do with learning and development, because we've done, as Julia said, a lot of the organisations have done recruitment projects, which we can talk about the detail of that a little bit later.
Yeah.
But actually, recruitment isn't just about bringing people into your organisation, it's that internal recruitment and that internal progression. And one of the things that we've brought learning and development into the programme, when we were talking about how do we transition our mentees once they've had this 12 months of mentoring, which, as Julia said, a lot's going to continue, but how do we transition that back into the organisation so that mentee continues to grow and thrive in that organisation and move forward?
Yeah.
And we started to look at the sort of training and development. So what training and development do we give our leaders? And in the same way that probably a few years ago we were thinking about what do we need to do to help women, to build women's confidence? And we started talking about things like imposter syndrome and resilience and, that sort of confidence building for women specifically. We started to say, well, what's the things that we need to think about for our ethnically diverse colleagues? And one of the big things that came out of that, and Julia sort of mentioned it a little bit, was about networks. So we had a fantastic session and it almost happened by accident, didn't it, Julia? We had a session in our movement meeting to talk to people about, so who's in your network? So we had our mentees, mentors and change champions together. And we were saying, so who are the people in your organisation that you speak to most to? Who do you make sense of the organisation with? Who are the go-to people when you've got an idea you want to talk through, or you've got a question or some help that you need? And we asked everybody to write down who those people were. And then we asked the question of, so how diverse is that network? And it was really stark. We asked our mentees to put the hand up if on their list of 10 people, 3 or more were from a diverse background. All our mentees put the hand up. When we looked at it the other way and said to the mentors, so how many have got 7 or more white people? Yes, they did. And I suppose some of it was about the levels in organisation, but it actually was one of those crack in the room moments when everyone suddenly thought, well, actually, it's not that diverse. People stay together with people like them. And actually, so the whole networking piece came out as that is something that we need to do with our leaders, all our future leaders, about networking for success. So for our mentees, how do they, and Julia mentioned this, how do they link up with people that matter inside and outside their organisation and get noticed? But also for our white leaders, how do they build diverse networks that challenge their thinking and improve their decision making? So that was a big one for us. And as Julia said, that whole understanding self, understanding your own barriers, understanding your own limitations was something that we talked about for our ethnically diverse colleagues. And also within that, to really push the idea that diversity brings fresh perspectives. And actually, they have to be confident to share their values, to share their knowledge, to share their deep understanding of their communities when we're talking about issues in housing. So that was, in a way, how we support our ethnically diverse colleagues. But in the same way, out of the women's leadership approaches, we learned that actually we need to educate the wider business, and particularly men, about menopause and how that affects women. We also have a raft of things about how do we support the wider leadership teams to understand more about ethnically diverse colleagues.
Absolutely.
That's what Julie was saying about this isn't about changing organisations to fit in with our white culture. This is how we change the culture so everybody can genuinely be themselves at work. And one of the things that came out really strongly from that is we need to educate white leaders to really understand the lived experience. And a lot of it came out in the Black Lives Matter. If you think of when all that burst on the scene, and for a lot of white people, it's like, oh, what happened? Why do they feel like this? And the real anger and hurt that came out. And one of the things I often reflect on and being involved in this programme is somebody asked me, when did you realise you were white? And it was one of those questions, you're like, what? I could have been white. But then, the person that asked me the question said, well, if you're a black person, you usually go back and remember that moment where something happened and you thought, why have I just been treated differently? You go home and talk to your parents about it and they say, get used to it, you're different. And actually you've got to adapt. So that whole thing about how we build that knowledge for white people, that story that we told about going into a supermarket. There was another one, wasn't there, Julie, that stopped us in our tracks when we were talking about the penalty shootout in the England match a few years ago when Rashford and one of the other black players missed the penalty. And, what came back to us there from our mums in the audience is that almost every one of them immediately rang or texted their sons that were out watching the match to say,